Well, welcome to the show. It's so great to have you.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate you calling me onto this. This will be fun. I'm looking forward to it.
This is going to be great. So let's dive right into it. I'd love to get a little bit of the history of yourself and your own background. I also coming from a legal background, have to ask the question about how you went from corporate law straight into tech early. It looks like you did some work with the provincial government, but yeah, just a little bit of that early story about what dragged you into Canadian tech.
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, I think it goes back to what drew me into law to begin with, right? I mean, I think, I applied to law school, I went to law school, I graduated from law school with the hopes that I could have an impact, right? I mean, I really felt, at the time when I was, in my undergrad, it felt like the world was transforming. It was early days of a lot of the transformations. Big things were happening. We're talking about a post 9/11 world, and I thought to myself, like, how do I play a part in this? How can I participate? And how can I have an impact? And so I went into law school and graduated from law school with the hopes and intention of being able to change the world and, all the great things all the ambitious things that I think we all hope to do when we're young. And then I remember kind of practicing law early, for the first couple of years. And I thought to myself, this is pretty disconnected from actually having a huge impact. Like I was a securities lawyer and I had this Securities Act, which was pretty much this thick, and I was going through it every day. And I'm like, this is not where I belong. This is not what I intend to do. And so since then, and up until today, it's been a journey. I mean, it's been a journey and a discovery of the world, of myself, most importantly, and the intersection about where, I fit into the world and where I can have the greatest impact. And that seems to continue to change as the world changes around us.
Yeah, I mean, particularly also coming from the legal background too. It's funny how much law firms need tech anyway, especially in Canada. Like you walk into a law firm practice and there's just so much manual and paper, it kind of blows your mind, right? And so
yeah. I always, it's pretty deeply embedded in the legal profession. Like the legal profession has always kind of looked at precedent. So it's always been very backward facing, just in its DNA. What have previous cases taught us about the law? What is, and it's so deeply rooted in just in history. So it can be, in some ways, that's a beautiful thing. And there's a lot of really amazing things to cherish, but it can also hold the institution back from being able to adapt with the times and move quickly enough. And I frankly didn't find that I fit well in that universe. So I just kind of, two steps forward, I went in pursuit of trying to figure out what I wanted to do. It started actually with a quick story here. I decided the best thing that I could do when I was trying to figure out, where do I belong and where do I fit, was go back and read the personal statement that I wrote to get into law school to begin with.
ah, cool.
Because I felt like that was probably the most kind of honest, the most authentic piece of writing I had done about what it is that I wanted to do and my ambitions. And things can get lost along the way, pressures and social and, what success is defined as. And so I went back and I read that, and it was pretty far removed from where I actually was at that time. So, at the time I talked about the UN, I talked about global institutions, I talked about changing the world. And so I thought, I got to try to figure out how to do that. And it's not going to be easy, but it's a journey worth pursuing. So I actually went out and I worked at the UN for a bit. I had that experience. That really introduced me to public policy and the impact of public policy, and how good public policy can really have a compounding effect on society over time. And bad public policy can be a huge hindrance. But public policy can oftentimes be a very academic exercise, and I wanted to, get my hands dirty. And so, I thought a little bit about politics. I explored that a little bit. And then ultimately I went off and I, started building OneEleven, because I felt like that was actually that was at the cusp of where I felt the world and the universe was going. So.
Yeah, so let's definitely dig into that, because you go from that more policy side to actually creating something within Toronto that becomes massive. Where does creating OneEleven come from? Does it come from your work within the provincial government? Like, give us a little bit of the backstory to that. How does it get started?
I mean, listen, I think, I referred to discovery earlier, right? And I think self-discovery is it's a fascinating thing. And, I think society oftentimes expects us to have everything figured out early and when we're young. And sometimes some people do, and that's amazing. But for me, I didn't have a lot of that mentorship early on in my life. And I didn't really know what the professional world looked like Both my parents, first generation Canadians, they both worked in factories, worked their way up. And so I didn't have anybody really guiding me. So for me, it was all about like just trying to figure out how the world operated first. Like how do our communities operate, and how does that intersect with the economy, and how does that intersect with government and business and all these different pieces. So when I was in government and I was in Ministry of Economic Development, the fascinating thing about that platform was it gave me a 30,000-foot view of our economy. It kind of showed the big kind of shifts that were happening in our economy. What was happening to our auto industry, which industries were on the up and up, and which ones were struggling and transforming. And through that, one thing became clearly obvious to me is that technology and innovation was kind of the foundation of the new economy. It was, we were at the final chapter of what I call the old economy, this kind of manufacturing and commodities-based economy, which Canada has thrived on for the last 100 years. And we were in the early chapters of the ideas and knowledge economy, which, by the way, the rules were fundamentally different than the rules of the old economy. Yet we had designed our entire society around these old rules, and we had to very quickly transform to these new rules. And we're right in the thick of that right now, and I don't think we're there, but there's a lot to be done. So sitting at the perch that I was sitting at that time, it became, at least to me, obvious that we needed to really build what I call the digital infrastructure of the new economy here in Canada.
Yeah, and this really is at the beginning of it, right? If we look back, you're working there about 10 years ago. All of this stuff, and it's crazy to think that it was only 10 years ago because of the growth that we've had, but things like MSix Ventures, like all of these different things that are now foundational to the Canadian tech community kind of happen all around that same time. So you could see that happening around you, and you were a part of it. Just walk us through the next steps in terms of actually, I'm going to start this thing. We need an accelerator here in Toronto, and what that looked like.
Yeah, I mean, so listen, it wasn't a novel concept, right? I mean, we had Y Combinator, we had early days of Techstars and 500 startups. Those were kind of very grassroots. Here in our own backyard, we had large institutions like Mars and Communitech, and these, what we called at the time RICs, which were regional innovation centers. And they were all pretty much, in Canada at least, they were all pretty much defined by and built by government. They were quasi-governmental. They were funded primarily by government institutions. And I think that was fantastic. I thought, I think government plays an incredibly important role in building infrastructure. Governments kind of play, in my opinion, three really important roles. They're there to legislate and protect, the people. They're there to create an environment for economic growth and for businesses to operate, and they need to invest in infrastructure. So I think that they spent the early days building some of that infrastructure, but, I didn't think, and I remember very clearly, at that time thinking to myself that the ecosystem is evolving so quickly, this community is growing so rapidly, and it felt like there were some major gaps that existed that, frankly, some of the existing institutions weren't able to adapt to quickly enough, or they weren't able to, maybe not see, or whatever the situation was. And so I just felt like, something needed to be done. And, at that time I had two options: either stay in government and try to affect change within, which frankly, I just thought was just very difficult. And, governments can be very cautious and careful when they, taking new steps, or try to get out there and, try to roll up my sleeves and build something. And I frankly think the private sector is the strongest driver of innovation. It needs to fundamentally take the lead when it comes to innovation and when it comes to our economy. So,
yeah, I mean, this is big, right? You're only a few years out of law school, and you're essentially starting your own startup, right? It's a company, it's an accelerator that's going to house a whole bunch of other companies. I mean, how did you get your first investors involved? Some amazing companies come through very early, right? We have Wealthsimple, Borrowell, Clio. How did you convince the first few companies? What was that process like?
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, there were some incredibly forward-thinking institutions around us at the time, including OMERS, including, OCE at the time was one of the, founding partners. Ryerson was right there, and president of Ryerson, Sheldon Levy, and it was alongside Mohammed Lakshmi, who was the provost at the time that became the president, like just doubled down on the idea. So, some really forward-thinking institutions that kind of broadly understood that something was going on and we needed to do something. So I think, credit where credit is due. With the early, like anytime you launch something from scratch, you need to build credibility very quickly, and you need to be very thoughtful about how you decide to build and how you decide to launch something. So, you talk about these incredible companies that were kind of, the anchors of OneEleven, in many ways. And it was quite deliberate. The long and short of it is that I actually didn't, attract those companies. Those companies attracted each other. My job was to make sure that the first few companies that we had in OneEleven were just rock stars, the best companies doing the most innovative, most interesting things, in many cases, entrepreneurs that were like deeply embedded in the innovation ecosystem, because I wasn't, right? And so, I needed to make sure that whatever we were building I wasn't building it for myself or building it for, or for the, the bottom line. We were building this for entrepreneurs. We were building this for our primary stakeholders, which were like the ones that were taking the risks, and putting everything on the line. And so, the earliest entrepreneurs we had were guys like Ali Asaria from Tulip Retail, and he built well.ca prior to that. And so he was like like massively important. I remember, once we got Ali on board, Carrie Lou from RubaCloud, basically when Ali came on board, he was just like, this is amazing. And he told his friends and his friends told his friends. And, as long as we, really nurtured our primary, like our first cohort of, leaders and entrepreneurs and, and customers, and we took care of and listened very carefully to what their needs were and what they were doing, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. People wanted to work alongside guys like Michael Katchen. People wanted to work alongside guys like, like Albert from Big Viking and all these, great entrepreneurs. So, if there's one, stroke of brilliance in all this, it's that I wasn't concerned about filling up space. I wasn't concerned about trying to meet rent roll, and I think oftentimes when you have physical spaces, you're just really concerned about filling up the space as quickly as possible. And that was not the purpose of what we were trying to create. We were trying to create a vibrant innovation ecosystem. And in order to do that, we had to make sure that it was grassroots, that it was built by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs. And I think that was maybe some of the magic early on.
Yeah. And just like a tech company doing well, some of that magic led to really big growth, right? Like you go from a 5,000 foot space in Richmond and York to this massive data center on Front Street West. And I myself got to benefit from that and walking into that huge space. I mean, that growth is amazing. Did anything about that process surprise you? It was so quick, and all of a sudden you've got this huge building and a even bigger vision for the next few years out.
Yeah. I mean, it was all a surprise. I mean, anybody that sits there and tells you, that's seen any success, anybody that sits there and tells you that, oh yeah, it was all me, I had this whole thing planned out, I don't buy it. I think you can have big ambitions and you can have, you could want to do big things, and you have to keep challenging yourself to push, the needle and to continue to test new business models. But of course, it was a huge surprise. And once, we had big ambitions from the beginning, but the moment we pulled the trigger on it, we were hyper-focused on the day-to-day, like how can we make sure that today is a good day for ourselves, for our clients, customers, for the entrepreneurs, for the ecosystem. And if we had enough good days, it turned into something, it compounded into something interesting. So yeah, overall, like the growth of it was a surprise. We always had the ambitions from day one, but you have to lay one brick at a time.
And the support, right? So let's go back to the grand opening of 325 Front Street West. I was there. I remember Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stopping by. I remember the Ontario Minister being there. I remember Mayor John Tory being there, University of Toronto staff, MSix Ventures, RBC. You managed to pull together all of these different sectors, right? So we have 3 layers of government. We have academia. We have some of the biggest private players. So, I mean, how was that all able to come together? You've said also at one time that OneEleven could have only happened in Toronto. Was that a little bit of what you meant by that? In that there's so many different people that could be involved here.
Yeah, let me. It's a fascinating question. I want to touch on that, but let me go back for a second to your previous question, because another piece to the puzzle that I don't think a lot of people talk about or know is that, you know, there was a partner. I had a partner in crime, you know, and you know, shortly after we launched OneEleven, a fellow by the name of Haroon Mirza, you know, was with me in the trenches building OneEleven alongside me, and you know, and I think it, you know, that feeds into the question you just asked me really well, because you know, I think we complemented each other really well. Like, he was an entrepreneur who had built a company and sold it previously, and so, you know, one thing, you know, I was hypersensitive and hyper aware of is I didn't want to be perceived as like a fraud, or like I was trying to be someone I wasn't, right? And you know, and it took time for me to build a credibility with the entrepreneurial ecosystem, but you know, having someone like Haroon really helped accelerate that, because you know, he had experienced it, and he had been in the trenches, and he had known, you know, what it takes, and had been part of that ecosystem and community. And so, you know, when you talk about that big grand opening where we brought all these big institutions and we had all these incredible entrepreneurs there, like, it was two sides of that coin, right? Like, I was, you know, I very much was able to bring the prime minister. I was able to bring some of the large institutions, you know, create that buzz and create that hype. But, you know, none of that would have been possible without, you know, the credibility and the resources of my partner, who helped build the credibility within the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So, you know, like, you know, and I only highlight Haroon right now, but we had an incredible team. It was really small and really lean, but like, this team was like world class. I mean, they just were so passionate about what we were doing. You know, there was nothing that they couldn't overcome. And they were willing to work their tails off to see this become successful. So, you know, you're sitting here interviewing me, but really there's a number of people that were a major part of this chapter.
Yeah, it's so good that you highlight them, right? Like, an incredible team always is behind some of the bigger things that happen in every situation.
100%. Without which, like, you know, you need to build a team where one person, you know, equals five. And that's what we had, you know, like these, you know, we had a small team, but they were just punching way above their weight. So, you know, I highlight all that. I think that's incredibly important. But, you know, answering the question around, you know, bringing all the people together, and only something like this could only happen in Canada. Like, yeah, I mean, you know, listen, I've got mixed emotions about that whole exercise, right? I think, you know, one of the reasons why we built OneEleven, one of the reasons why I was so passionate about building OneEleven, is because we needed more of that, right? We needed more of that kind of the bridge building, you know, building, you know, institutions that sit at the intersection of all these siloed parts of our economy. And we needed to bring that all together to like build a really vibrant innovation ecosystem. And I didn't think it was happening enough before we built OneEleven. And unfortunately, I don't think it happened enough afterwards. You know, I still don't feel like we're aligned. I struggle with this a lot, because the word alignment is a really important concept for me, right? And if we want to see Canada's innovation ecosystem really prosper, we need stronger alignment, right? It means we have to get all of our pieces working like a well-oiled machine, you know? And there's got to be like a pipeline for innovation, you know? Like, we spent all this time building infrastructure and resources and railroads and for like the oil pipelines, you know, that got oil moving from one part of the world, one part of our economy to the other part of our economy. And we invested in all that over, you know, a generation or more. But we don't have that same infrastructure, that digital infrastructure for the new economy. So how do we get these ideas and products off the ground? How do we get them commercialized, and how do we scale them? It's a very similar exercise to building the infrastructure of, you know, our oil industry, you know, where, you know, you needed to build good policy. You needed to have really ambitious entrepreneurs. You needed capital pools, very deep capital pools, to be able to grow and scale these things. And we did that successfully. And I'm confident we'll do this successfully, but I don't think we're there yet. And some parts of the country, to be very honest with you, are better than others. You know, I would say that Ontario is struggling. Ontario has always struggled because I don't know, there's not good alignment here. When you compare us to like Quebec, for example, I think Quebec is very sophisticated when it comes to identifying opportunities and scaling them up and aligning, government, capital, industry, talent, all along this kind of, ambitious objectives that they've created. Now, Quebec tends to do it exclusively for Quebec, and sometimes they participate beyond. But Ontario just has not been able to do it in the same way. The pension funds, play a really important role here. In Quebec, the Caisse de dépôt is kind of it's an anchor to the Quebec institution. It funds a lot of other venture funds. It funds a lot of capital. It helps companies go public, and it gives them the runway to be able to do that. And I think in Ontario and the rest of Canada, we've got kind of the seedling of that. And we've got good signals, but I don't think we're there yet. And I think we've still got a ways to go.
Yeah, so many interesting parts to that. I mean, you said before that there's a difference, right, between a vibrant startup ecosystem and a vibrant scale-up system. And I remember that always being a huge call out within OneEleven, that it's time now to not just focus on starting Canadian companies, but actually helping companies grow rapidly here, right? And I think that's, if we were to take a step back, that's really what you're referring to, right? Is that next step of actually building it all the way through.
Absolutely. I mean, the fundamental difference, and I'm not sure we still understand this, and we've been preaching this for over a decade. There's a fundamental difference between starting a company and scaling a company. And it requires a whole different set of resources. It requires an entirely different set of, a different mindset and a different set of resources and capital and all that stuff. So, we have to start shifting our perspective from starting companies to scaling them. But we can't lose sight of still starting companies, because if we don't have a strong pipeline of early stage companies, then we're never going to be able to build a pipeline for scaling up. It's like a sales pipeline, right? Like, you have to have a really, really wide funnel that brings in a lot of talent and a lot of ideas and a lot of entrepreneurs at the earliest stages. And you need to give them capital, resources, and runway to be able to validate their opportunity. And the ones that really find that product market fit, the ones that really take off and show promise, we need to double, triple, quadruple down on those opportunities in a massive way. And we need to have the infrastructure that can support that. So I've always been a strong advocate for the scale-up ecosystem. It's not easy to do. Let me just say, Canada has historically been a small, medium-sized enterprise economy. A majority of our companies have been small, medium-sized businesses. And that's great. Actually, that's a very strong foundation for a vibrant economy. You want lots of small businesses. You want a lot of medium-sized businesses to be able to grow and to be able to, and provide jobs and employment and all that stuff. But you need to be able to anchor all of that with some very large homegrown Canadian institutions, right? And that's where the gap always existed. And so we've done this great job of like supporting and nurturing the SMEs and getting them working and building a vibrant economy that allows people to, move from lower socioeconomic classes to medium to upper, right? I mean, that's the bridge. You need to be able to have small, medium-sized businesses and a number of other things. But at the same time, there needs to be a waterfall, right? You need to have the small businesses with the opportunity to scale to medium sizes, and then those mediums with the potential to be able to scale to large institutions and be able to go global in a big way. And so we've got a lot to learn on the latter end of this spectrum. And I think we do phenomenally well at the earlier stages of this.
Right. Yeah. And this is great because we can tackle at so many different areas because you're so involved, right? I mean, you're still involved now, I think, in 9 different active roles. You're involved at the federal level, at the provincial level, at the private sector, obviously with Deloitte. You're involved in venture capital as well. So, I mean, just looking at it through that Ontario lens again, I mean, what's really changed since you founded OneEleven? Where have things gotten better, and where do you still think that we need to see the most improvements?
Yeah. Listen, this is it's a technical conversation, and there's a lot of technical aspects of this that I think need to be that can be discussed and double clicked on, and really, we could do a deep dive on. But broadly speaking, I think our single greatest opportunity at this moment in time is talent. And talent comes in so many different forms, but immigration is going to be one major form of talent. The world has shut its door to so many talented people for political purposes. And it makes absolutely no sense. When you think about Silicon Valley as kind of the mecca of innovation, the secret sauce has always been the talent pool. People come to Silicon Valley for one primary purpose: to achieve their dreams, and that is an incredible draw. And I think the Canadian dream is alive and well, and there's a lot that this country has to offer. It used to be that people used to come to Canada, one, because there were opportunities, but two, because it was a great place to raise your family. And I think we've gone way beyond that. I think it's absolutely a phenomenal place to raise your family, but it also has incredible opportunities. And, it's got a vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem, and people can come here and just anchor down and build things, right? And we need to encourage that. The other part about immigration that's super important, and that we don't talk enough about, is our population base. We've got a very small population for such a massive region. And those demographics are going to have long-term implications on our economy. And unless we actually grow our base, our consumer base, our population base right across this country, we're not going to be able to afford the quality of life, the healthcare, the pension plans, everything that we've taken for granted and that that makes Canada such a wonderful place to be and live. We need to attract more people. And then, the final part about the immigration story is that it's not enough to just immigrate people over here. There's two really important parts. One is we need to help settle immigrants. And so we need to open doors for them. We need to leverage their existing talents. We need to be able to integrate them really well so that they feel like they're productive members of this society and our economy. And then second is, we also have to be patient. I'm the son of a second generation, first generation immigrants. My parents came to this country, and, they had hopes and dreams for their children, hopes and dreams that they had for themselves that they had to sacrifice and that they had to dismiss to help the next generation succeed and to realize, what ultimately became their dreams. So, this is a long game, and it's gonna go way past our lifetime in this generation. And so we need to create the right circumstances and the right environment for people to feel included, to feel like they're part of something greater, and to give them the freedom to operate and to succeed, whether it's this generation or the next. Because if my parents hadn't had the opportunities, or if they, weren't able to come here, then certainly I wouldn't be doing some of the things that I'm doing to give back to our community, and certainly the country that I'm so thankful to be a citizen of. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, talent is so critical. We know this too. I had talked to Ilya Brodsky of VanHack, who's just constantly trying to bring people in. And I think people are starting to realize just how big of a well there is in talent. I mean, we talk about developer talent or anywhere else, just pulling them to Canada is so critical. Looking potentially as well at the capital sphere in Canada. You started MSix Ventures. How do you feel about Canada's access to capital? Do you see anything there that needs to change? I mean, one of the big criticisms of Canada is it's hard to get early stage capital. It's hard to get really late stage capital towards an IPO level. How do you look at that sphere of things?
Capital is such a critical part of this story, that I think we don't spend a lot of time on, or we don't think about. In order to scale, you hear all the time, in order to start a company, you need a laptop and an internet connection and some lines of code. And I think that's absolutely true. But in order to scale a company, it's a whole different beast. It's a fundamentally different beast. And I think, I know some people, I've gone to debates on this a lot. A lot of people will say that there's enough capital in the ecosystem. Yeah. We have so much more capital than we had before. But the stakes have changed as well from over a decade ago. even if you look at what valuations look like at the seed A and B range, they're just so much higher than what they used to be. And when you think about what it takes to compete in the digital economy, where it's a winner takes all, where you're building a winner takes all platforms, you need to basically have a treasure trove. You need a war chest to be able to acquire and grow as quickly and as rapidly as possible. And so capital becomes hugely important. And that's one part of the equation. The other part of capital that becomes important is that capital are deeply tied to ownership structures. And so where the capital is coming from begins to dictate who owns what we're building, right? And so if we're forced to go outside of Canada to raise larger and larger pools of capital, the reality of the fact is that these companies will ultimately become, multinationals, foreign multinationals. They become foreign institutions, and they'll be run and owned by, institutions and people that are not deeply embedded within Canada, that maybe they're not aligned or committed to Canada the same way that Canadian institutions would be. And so we need to be a lot more thoughtful and a lot more calculated in how we create capital pools. And we need to think about capital pools very closely tied to infrastructure. I think those two parts and pieces play a really important part. Go back to mining, because mining was such an important part of the Canadian economy. I mean, we had dedicated mining exchanges, where public markets could be able to participate and allocate large pools of capital to that sector in order for those companies to go out and start exploring, right? Exploration and then drilling. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we have the infrastructure, the institutions, and the deep pools of capital to be able to help these companies really win. Because the other part about this story is that when you build a company in Canada, you're competing with the rest of the world. Technology companies are fundamentally different. With mining, for example, if you found a mine, it was yours. You could basically put a line around it and say, this is, we're going to extract, and the benefits will come back to us, will recruit back to us. But in technology, there's no borders. You can't put a square around this. And so, whatever you're building it. The platforms and the institutions are global in nature. And so you almost from day one are competing against Google and Amazon and Facebook and all these, huge, and Netflix and all these huge institutions. And that is both a great opportunity, and really should push us to take things to the next level. But at the same time, we can't be delusional about the scale of those institutions and how do Canadian companies compete, right? So.
And I'm glad that you brought up mining, actually, because it comes up to another question that I have about our private sector. So the BDC report in 2017, when it talked about holes in the Canadian ecosystem, mentioned two things. We just talked about one of them, which is just capital. The second piece is the biggest Canadian corporations, other than really financial services, which we've definitely seen get more and more involved in the Canadian tech scene over the years. They're really not buying or investing heavily in Canadian startups. And there's a bunch of different theories for that, right? So if it's mining and some of these older industries where they're just tech laggards anyway, so it's going to take them more time. Other ones that I've heard are that they're not anti-Canadian, but they'd prefer to buy from the startup from Israel or from Silicon Valley or from London. What do you make of that, and how can we get the private sector more involved?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think the private sector operates with a great degree of, or a higher degree of, or a reasonably high degree of efficiency and productivity. And so the private sector absolutely needs to go where the opportunities are. This is not a charitable institution where we should just be, it's the right thing to do. I mean, it absolutely is the right thing to do, and I can make a long case for why that's the case. But in order for this to work and for it to be sustainable, we need to actually have Canadian companies of scale. I mean, a lot of these large institutions, they can, they will suffocate an early stage company. With all of their compliance and all of the rules and regulations by which they operate. Trust me, I've been living in it for the last couple of years, and I see how these institutions work. And they built these processes and they built them for accountability, right? And so there's very strict accountability measures. There's very strict compliance measures that need to be met. And so if you're too early stage, you're just going to get you're going to drown in that. I think that problem number one is actually not we need more private sector to participate. We need we need to get companies at a sufficient scale to be able to easily begin to connect with the private sector and adopt those technologies, have them adopt those technologies. Now, that being said, I'm not defending anybody here. What I'm saying, though, is that there's a fine balance between having companies get to a stage and scale at which they're ready to actually go at enterprise grade adoption. And I'm saying that large institutions need to meet them halfway, and so we need to be able to take, greater chances on promising Canadian technology companies. And we have to take, we have to make create the appropriate framework for that to happen and for that to be successful. But I do think that this is it's kind of like it's a marketplace problem. You need enough supply for the demand to be able to kind of use that. But if you don't have enough of the institutions that are willing to do it, then you're never going to get enough supply. So how do we build a really successful marketplace where both sides of the equation, and you kind of find that balance where both sides of the equation are benefiting to their and meeting their primary objectives, which is to grow and to scale.
And part of it is just finding spaces for both of them to meet, right? Like within OneEleven, I saw this a whole bunch of times where we get really huge retailers or really large financial institutions and come in and say, okay, you're 8 people now, but they followed along with the people's growth. And over time, they were able to land larger enterprise deals because there was that education.
Absolutely. So you raise a great point. And one of the main reasons why we built OneEleven was to create these collisions. We called them collisions at the time, which was, how do we get large enterprises, how do we create exposure, like early stage startups, how do we give them the exposure to large institutions so that even if they're not ready today, that over time they'll be ready? And how do you build a trust? Because trust is a really important part of this equation as well. How do you build a trust between the capital providers and the entrepreneurs and the large, the large private sector institutions? And how do you get them all feeling like they're part of the same ecosystem? Because I think for most part, they all operate in their own silos and in their own domains. And that can be hugely problematic when you're trying to the future of our economy is going to be increasingly more interconnected. And so having these pieces kind of work more closely together plays an incredibly important part, I think. Yeah.
So now let's go to what's happened this year in terms of COVID, right? So we know that these spaces are positive when people can come into them. They can't this year. I mean, how do you think, just watching how everything's played out this year, how do you think about COVID for Canada's tech ecosystem? Is it an opportunity? Is it a bit of a threat? Is it both? Like, how are you looking at it for us?
Yeah, I mean, listen, we're in the thick of this right now. So there's so much uncertainty. Right, and I think that is the most important piece of this puzzle. Right, is the uncertainty of it all. Like, people are going to be nervous to do anything because they can't predict or can't, with any reasonable amount of prediction, know what's going to happen. Forget years from now, but months from now, weeks from now, right? And so it's much easier, and it's frankly much safer and more prudent, or at least the sentiment is that it's more prudent to just be cautious and be cautiously optimistic and just kind of move carefully and make sure you're not burning too quickly and you've got good runway and et cetera, because you just don't know how long this is all going to last for. I think where we are right now, there is irreconcilable damage done to our economy, and we're going to have to live with that. And the thing about that is, it's like a crop, we had really sowed the seeds for an incredible crop of amazing things in this economy, and COVID came and wiped it all out. And so, our crop is not going to harvest this year, and we've got to figure out ways to kind of preserve the crop, and we've got to, figure out ways to continue investing and planting new seeds and continuing to build on that. But at the same time, a lot of institutions, a lot of companies won't make it through this, which inherently creates an opportunity as well for new entrepreneurs and new ideas, and organizations to be able to accelerate some of their digital transformations. I think I was reading this funny post that was put up recently, and it said what led to your company's transformation, and it said CEO, and it said I think board of directors, and then it said COVID-19. And COVID is absolutely the right answer. I mean, COVID accelerated this digital transformation for existing institutions like legacy institutions, but also new companies, that are becoming digitally native. When you think about e-commerce and retail, that, that in part ties to the success of Shopify, right? I mean, every company and entrepreneur now is trying to figure out how do they build their how they become digitally native, and how do they build their digital infrastructure. So I think to your point, there's both opportunity and damage that will there'll be a result of this. But one thing we can't do is lose sight of this. There will be a post-COVID world. On the other side of this, we will continue to build and we'll continue to grow. And I think that in the fine words of the wise words of Mark Andreessen, it's time to build, right? And I do fundamentally believe that whatever we do, I don't care whether it's what the timing is, we can't wait to build. So I think we need to start doing that now at all levels of government and in the private sector.
And just to end off on this part, I mean, where do you hope to see? You've been so involved now for the past 10 years. You obviously continue to be involved. Where do you hope to see Canada in the next 5 years or so, coming out of COVID and after everything?
Yeah. Listen, I think that we have a tremendous opportunity in front of us. I mean, when you think about what's happening to economies around the world, when you see how COVID has impacted populations around the world, this core sense of safety doesn't even exist in some of the most advanced economies around the world. That's a pretty big thing, and here in Canada, listen, I mean, we've been impacted and we've struggled, and people and families have been deeply impacted by this, but we are navigating this far better than most economies around the world. And that is going to lead, if we don't take advantage of that opportunity, both the safety and the discipline of our governments and the actions that we've taken, the fact that the private sector stepped up the way that it has, that everyone's been so aligned and reasonable about, this virus and knowing that we're in this together. Listen, it's not us versus each other. It's us versus this virus, this unknown. I think is a tremendous opportunity for us. And it's going to be an opportunity for talent and people to want to migrate here. We need to continue to bring the best and brightest from around the world here. We need to really focus on that. How do we target, the talent pools and the type of people we want here? I think, we will continue to, with the advent of remote work and the future of work more broadly is going to create tremendous opportunities for Canada. If you can work anywhere in the world, why wouldn't you want to live and operate in a place like Canada and be able to work, on projects all around the world? So I think that's another, tremendous opportunity for us. And then, the last thing I'll say is that, I think we're a beacon of hope. I think we've shown leadership on the world stage and really kind of shown that, there are some really important issues like climate change and civil rights and all these other things that are incredibly important that we hold very dear and near to our economy and to our nation. And so I think that, we can continue to be proud of that and showcase all the incredible things that this city has. And then the last thing, this is maybe where I'll end it all off, is, I do believe that, places like Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver and places all across this incredible country, we're like a coiled spring ready to pop, you know, like we're just like, you could feel the energy, you could feel the enthusiasm, the ambition is getting bigger, the capital pools are getting bigger. Like, I like to think of us as a scale up. You know, the Canada is a scale up. You know, we're like in the early stages of, you know, going from, you know, we're 150 years old, you know, and we're going from the, you know, earliest stages of kind of building a functioning society and functioning economy to now taking all of those pillars that we've created and now really going big and like building large institutions. Our cities are transforming so rapidly. You know, we're building so many things. We're trying to build a clean economy. We're trying to build an inclusive economy. Like, all these things matter. You know, we care about stakeholder engagement. You know, we care about, you know, sustainable goals. So, you know, I can't tell you how excited I am about the future of Canada. We've got to figure things out, and we've got to make sure that we're aligned around some of these bigger and more ambitious goals. And that's, you know, we will never get past that unless our municipal, provincial, and federal governments are aligned with the public sector. They're all communicating and working together towards this goal. But if we can make that happen, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there will be no better place in the world to be.
I think that's the perfect place to end off. That's awesome. Thank you so much for coming on again, Bilal. It's been a true pleasure.
Yeah, Mark, I appreciate you taking the time, and I hope the listeners learned something from this conversation.
For sure. All right. Thanks so much.
Okay.